Hello everybody, it's great to be here with you today. Today we're going to be focusing on architecture. And so what we're going to do is take this building design, and dissect it, and look at how the different parts fit together and what makes this building work from an architectural standpoint. This building is from the Concours Public d'Architecture. It's a publication that's a compilation of various design competitions that virtually all were produced using the design style of the École des Beaux-Arts that came out of Paris. And so this particular building is from the city of Saint-Étienne in the Loire Valley in France. And there are a lot of mines there. And so this design is intended to be for the Society of Mineralogy in that region. And so let's look at how to dissect this design. So, in the designs of the École des Beaux-Arts, there was a very strong tie between the plan geometry and the elevations and the three-dimensional aspects of the building. So let's start with the plan. There are a series of rooms that align to face toward the street, and you can see there's a central axis of each of these rooms that crosses at a round corner tower, and this round corner tower ends up being the primary focal point of the composition. And then back from these primary spaces that face toward the street, there are a series of secondary spaces that serve as a support for those primary spaces, so service spaces. And those are wrapping around an internal courtyard, so that for all of the spaces, the ones facing toward the street get light and air from the street side, and the interior spaces get their light and air from the courtyard. On the ground floor, there's a primary entrance from the street that heads back to a stairway, and the stairway is also protruding out into the courtyard to get light and air as well. So this produces a kind of a secondary focal point. The primary focal point is that corner tower, and the secondary focal point is that stair that enters the street-facing facade. Now, looking at the facade, let's take a look at first the big shapes, the overall massing. So what we have is actually a relatively simple overall massing. The building itself looks very ornamented and highly detailed, but we can see that the actual basic massing is really quite simple. There's a rectangular mass that forms the main body of the building, and then a slightly taller rectangular mass that forms that corner tower. It's useful when looking at massing, especially for this type of urban building, to look at masses that extend up to the cornice line first, because when you're standing in the street and looking up at the building, up at an angle, you oftentimes can't see the roof itself. You're basically constrained by the cornice line. Your view ends at the top of the cornice line. And it's only when standing back a long distance from the building that you can see the roof structure, which forms a skyline from further back. So, one primary mass here, forming the rectangular street facade, and then that corner tower. So yeah, looking from down below in the street, your view is basically constrained by that cornice line. And then looking from further back, for example, if you're looking down the street from a long way away, or if you're standing up on a tall spot looking out across the city and looking at the roofscape, then you begin to see the sculpture of the roof forms. So it's important to look at both of those separately. Look at the silhouette that's formed by the cornice line and the sculpture that happens there. You can see there's actually an interesting kind of a flourish that the architect placed above the entrance on that corner tower, right up at the cornice line, just under the base of the dome. So now that we have our basic massing, let's begin to look at how that is subdivided. So again, we want to work from large forms down to small forms and not get into the tiny details right away. Basically, we want to look at the overall order, the overall structure, and if we slowly subdivide that, big forms down to slightly smaller forms, down to slightly smaller forms, the whole composition will tie together and we'll have a strong sense of order. So in terms of horizontal divisions, you can see the building is comprised of three primary layers. There's kind of a base, a middle, and a top, and then the roof structure is up above that. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Once we have the primary horizontal layering, now what we're looking at is looking at the pattern of center lines, the rhythm of center lines. So first looking at center lines, vertical center lines through the voids. So you can see that the windows, the various voids or the fenestration lines up top to bottom of the building. And then in between each of those void center lines, there's a structural center line. And you can see that those line up as well from the top of the building all the way to the bottom of the building. So this actually creates a great sense of stability in this architecture. There's a lot of dynamism in terms of the flourishes and the details and so forth. This underlying kind of a structural skeleton where the structural center lines continue all the way from the very top of the building all the way down to the ground provide really a strong kind of a sense of stability. It looks like the building is having its weight transmitted visually all the way down to the ground, so it looks very stable. And looking again at those focal spots. So there's a focal spot around the doorway on the street facade, and then again that kind of flourish that's occurring around the corner tower, marking the corner as the primary focal spot. Now looking at the use of similar forms, echoing of similar forms in a facade is another way to create harmony. So on this building, the corner tower has that kind of a dome shape, elongated dome shape, so a circular form. And you can see there's actually echoing of these circular forms many places, especially in the top floors of the building. So the tops of those arches, the small roof vents are also in the shape of arches, and then the ornaments on the dome itself are circular as well. So this gives us a really good kind of a basic structural skeleton. And on top of that basic skeleton, it's possible now to start to lay in the fenestration pattern. So this is analyzing the pattern of solid and void. So marking each of the openings, so we can really see kind of the pattern of the solids and then the pattern of essentially the holes in the facade. This is all, again, much more important than the small details. The architecture of the École des Beaux-Arts was known for a high level of detail, which is actually quite beautiful when you get up close to the buildings, because there's a lot for the eye to take in, and it provides interest from a variety of distances from the building. Underneath all of that detail, the architecture from this time period had a very studied kind of a basic set of proportions and a kind of a structural skeleton that you can see that we're analyzing here that allows all of those details to hang together into a unified composition. So that basic structural skeleton is more important than the individual details. That's why we're starting with that first. So darkening in the pattern of the voids, blackening in the windows, so it's possible to see those most strongly. The architecture from this time period was designed to fit in urban environments, and I think it benefited from hundreds of years of practice designing for these urban environments, and people adjusted the designs of the buildings so that they were most satisfying when actually walking through an urban place. So that's one of the reasons why there is this kind of cascading level of detail in the buildings. The main structural pattern and the pattern of fenestration gives the building a beautiful order when you see it from a distance. And then as you approach the building, by adding layer upon layer of detail to the buildings, it essentially allows the architecture to continue to be satisfying to look at as you approach the building and get closer and closer to it. So even when you're just a couple of meters or a few feet in front of the building on the sidewalk, and you can't even see the top of the building anymore, there's still a satisfying level of detail in front of you and a beautiful composition to look at. Here we're beginning to look at the articulation of those main horizontal layers. We had drawn them kind of just with a single abstract line previously. Those are actually articulated with moldings to create shadow lines, so that when the building is seen in the sunlight, that horizontal layering, that division into those three main horizontal layers, is really prominent. Essentially, the relief on the facade, the projections and moldings and so forth, are all designed to create shadows. So this type of architecture is essentially drawing with shadows. And because we want those three main layers to read most prominently, they have the darkest shadow lines. So they have the deepest projection from the facade. And the subsequent detail and ornament and so forth projects from the facade as well, but not as deeply, so the shadow lines are more fine. So you can see the pilasters, for example, on the upper floor, or these balconies on the floor below, have some projection, but not nearly as much as those primary cornice and expression lines, which divide the building into those three main layers. A common characteristic of buildings of this time period is rustication, especially of the ground floor. So the upper floors have less detail in terms of this this kind of expression of the horizontal structure. The ground floor, to give the building a really firm base, oftentimes had the feeling of a strong coursing of stone added to that ground floor. Sometimes this was done with just lines in stucco that were meant to simulate stonework. The idea with this is to give the building a really strong base to sit on, but also to give the building kind of a rich amount of texture on the ground floor, so that, again, as you approach the building and get close to it, there's extra sculptural detail to meet your eye. And then these buildings oftentimes also, because they're seen from a variety of distances, when one steps back from the building and looks up at the top, there oftentimes was a bit more ornament at the top as well to give it kind of a crown. You can see detail in the arches, for example. The roof itself has beautiful detailing. So really the ground floor and then the top of the building, both of those have more detail. The middle of the building in the center tends to have less detail. So there's a strong base and a strong crown, and then a little bit more plain central panel, the central layer. And there was a strong sense of scale for these buildings as well. Again, they were built within urban environments over hundreds of years. You know, this architecture was refined and refined, this style of architecture. So the size of the various elements of the building in relation to a person is something that was very well studied, and there's a kind of a great pattern of that. It's one of the reasons why it's really good to analyze these buildings and look at them if you're interested in building buildings within an urban environment.